Hey there. Uh, this is my fourth one-take video. This is on Bride and Prejudice, but mostly it's about Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. Um, as usual, in my videos, I'm going to focus more on the literary side of things, the book side of things, than on the film itself. But I wanted to say a few things about Jane Austen as a literary figure. Austen wrote during what's considered the British Romantic period, which roughly dates from 1789 to 1832. However, Jane Austen really is not considered a romantic writer. So this has raised all sorts of problems particularly for professors and scholars um, who work in the Romantic period, who also want to work with Jane Austen. I mean, what makes her attractive, besides the fact that she's a wonderful writer, is that she's a woman writer at a time in which scholars and professors are trying to include more women writers in literary classes, which is, of course, very, very admirable. But as I said, it raises this problem of trying to include an unromantic writer in a romantic period literary class. Um, what am I talking about when I talk about romanticism? Well, three qualities in particular that relate to Jane Austen. One is the British Romantic writing is known to emphasize the works of the imagination. So creativity and poetry but imagination as a core value. And Jane Austen really doesn't come out of that tradition. She comes out of the tradition of realism, which, in a sense, Romanticism was reacting against. Secondly, the British Romantics, in terms thematically, were known for um, illicit passion or unconventional sexuality. We don't have that in Jane Austen. She's very conventional in her sexuality and in her romantic plots. Thirdly, the British Romantics were known for their engagement with political radicalism, particularly in their youth. Some of them, like William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge, later in life sort of turned their backs on their youthful radicalism. But other romantic writers, such as Mary Wollstonecraft and William Godwin, continued really to the end of their lives to hold to their political radical ideals. And when I say that, I mean that they were very excited about what was happening in the French Revolution, and something that the characters or the people in Jane Austen's novels and the people that she knew in the gentry were very much against that. So we don't have that political radicalism in Jane Austen's works. So those the three reasons why she's really not a romantic writer, um, but certainly a 19th century writer, 19th century novel. She anticipates many of the developments in particularly the sort of social novel in Britain, characterized. I mean, writers like George Eliot and Charles Dickens. So Jane Austen was coming out of a realistic tradition, not a romantic tradition, and it's the realistic tradition of the 18th century writers like Henry Fielding, um, and 19th century some of the writers that I just mentioned. In terms of marriage and convention or marriage and patriarchy, um, as I said, Jane Austen's heroes and heroines are very conventional in that regard. All of her female characters, their ultimate goal is to get married, and in the end, they do. Typically, after being put in their place by an older male. Again, this is very different than what the Romantics were writing about, and that her novels are. She represents a very politically conservative position in her novels, and one indication of that is that there's really not much mention of politics in her novel. And again, she set her novels amidst the gentry of the class that she came from. The gentry are part of the upper class in Britain. There's a British critic named Raymond Williams who wrote The Country and the City, but in that he wrote about Jane Austen, and he said that she wrote for her a knowable community. What he mean by that phrase is sort of the basically the people that she was allowed to know and the people she was allowed to see. So, for instance, there aren't really any poor people in her novels. Um, they weren't part of her knowable community. So, in a sense, people back then, they sort of wore blinders, and they saw what was relevant to their class and just sort of blanked out what was not relevant to their class. And this is a fairly conservative position. Um, so, as I've been saying, Jane Austen, not a romantic writer, writing during the supposed romantic period. However, it's interesting that on film, um, Jane Austen has been romanticized, and a good indication of that, or a good example of that, would be the last Pride and Prejudice version, with the one with Keira Knightley, which in almost every way takes Jane Austen's novel and romanticizes it, uh, in terms of makes it, in a sense, more liberal, and also, more interested in unconventional sexuality, and in a sense, more imaginative. So, I just wanted to point that out. Jane Austen is also very popular in popular culture. A couple books that show that. One is Pride and Prejudice and Zombies. I forget the author, but I read it a few years ago. It's a good read. I enjoyed it, and part of the reason I enjoyed it because I knew the original quite well. In fact, I've done papers and stuff on Jane Austen. Um, Another is Death Comes to Pemberley, a book that came out last year, I think, by P.D. James, a mystery writer, which basically uses the characters from Pride and Prejudice in the mystery. There's lots of other books like that. What I was talking about, fanon, in terms of fan fiction, and then of course Pride and Prejudice, but that's a film. So I'd like to make a distinction between the books. I think the books, um, I mean, part of what makes these reboots, like Death Comes to Pemberley or Pride and Prejudice and Zombies, what makes them popular is that they take Austen out of context for the sake of novelty or humor. For instance, taking Pride and Prejudice and setting it during a zombie war, and making the Bennett sisters these zombie warriors. Anyway, actually, there's a film coming out eventually. I think it's in production, and I'm waiting patiently for that film to come out, of Pride and Prejudice and Zombies, so I can add it to my syllabus to this class. But anyway, but part of what makes these books work is that they mimic the voice of Jane Austen, and that's really one of the more attractive aspects of the writing what makes Jane Austen, why people are still reading Jane Austen, because they like her voice. It's sort of the sardonic, subtle wit of it, and just the way she forms sentences and whatnot. Um, However, in the films, the film adaptations of Jane Austen, the ones that tend to romanticize her, tend to, like a lot of films do, don't really recreate her voice. Um, the voice of the author is replaced by nostalgia for the past, and we tend to focus on the characters and the plots, as opposed to the dialogue or the narrator's voice. So, and that's one way that the films have romanticized Jane Austen. They've done it in part by eliminating her voice, which as I've been saying, is a problem when it comes to adapting films. But so yeah, so that's what I have to say. That the films have romanticized Jane Austen, and in doing so have misplaced her voice. So I'll stop there, and we'll see if I can upload this